안녕하세요. 저는 로버트 켈리입니다. 저는 부산대 학교 교수입니다. My daughter is 11, and my son, so he is now 7 this year. He was like 9 months in the video, I think, right? At the time, they had no sense of it, of course. One reason why we were so nervous after the video, in the first week or so, we didn't talk to the media much and stuff. We tried to avoid, is because at the time the children were really young. But as they have both grown up, they are both aware now that they're famous. Particularly my daughter, who's now going through the whole K-pop and YouTube and TikTok, and she loves all that stuff now. Now she's like, I'm a movie star. She's like, she thinks she's like a celebrity and everything. So Yena's like doing dancing, and she's into like K-pop and BTS and Ivy and all that stuff. I don't know anything about that. Don't ask me. Ivy, I don't know. She always wants to order pizza from Papa John's because Ivy is on the cover of the box. And my son is a soccer player. Apparently he's pretty good for his age too. The coach says he's a good player. I'm not sure if she remembers it, but I mean, she's seen the video a million times, and all of her friends at school know who she is. Well, my students do too, right? Whenever I teach, on the very first day, I'm like, I'm the BBC dad, and all the students are like, yeah, we know, that's why we're taking your class. Oh my God, nobody wants to learn anything. All they want to do is listen to me tell stories about my kids. Like, it's so embarrassing. Yeah, I mean, we got a lot of attention from it. Yeah, I mean, people would stop us in airports and movie theaters and be like, are you that guy? I'm like, yeah, I'm that guy. Like, oh, wow, really? Like people came up to the airport and like, can I have your autograph? And I'm like, okay. I mean, I don't know. People ask me for pictures and stuff. I mean, I always say yes, right? I mean, most people's attention is kind. And we got some of that, like, you shouldn't marry a Korean woman. We got some of that stuff. But most of it is like, oh, your kids are so cute, and oh, it's so hard to be a parent, and so most people were very positive and very upbeat and thought the kids were really cute, and so I always try to be responsive to that. When people ask me for pictures, I say yes, and I sign things. I mean, so it's fine. I mean, it's nice, right? It's a nice video, and it made a lot of people happy in the world. I mean, a lot of people wrote to me and be like, your video made me smile, and that's pretty cool, right? You brought some happiness to the world, so I'm glad that people liked it. I think the United States wants unification. I think the United States broadly supports South Korea's claims to govern the whole peninsula, right? So the South Korean Constitution, like the first page of the South Korean Constitution, says South Korea governs the entire peninsula. I think the United States supports that. I think that we see North Korea as a very scary, difficult place. It's governed very, very badly. It's got a terrible human rights record, and it's got very, very scary weapons now, right? We worry a lot that North Korea will sell them to terrorists or use them. I think, there's a lot of fears about proliferation. So the United States, I think, broadly speaking, supports South Korea's traditional, long-standing claim to be the Korean government for the two Koreas, right? And like I said, that's in the Constitution, and that's sort of South Korea's formal statement. I think this is why the American relationship with Moon Jae-in was kind of difficult, because the Moon Jae-in administration, it was pretty clear that Moon Jae-in and the people around him wanted a relationship where North Korea and South Korea maybe were like recognizing each other, or they had some kind of consular relationship, or South Korea was going to invest in North Korea, that South Korea wasn't just going to reject North Korea's existence, it was going to coexist, and there would be investment and trade and all kinds of things like that. And the Americans don't really accept that, right? I think America generally is more comfortable with the conservative party in South Korea than the progressive party in South Korea, because the conservatives in South Korea, President Yoon and many others like him, going back to Lee Myung-bak and whatever, broadly kind of share the same belief that the Americans do about North Korea, which is that it's a really illegitimate state, it's really sort of terribly governed state, and it would be best for the world if it went away. And so that's why, generally speaking, I think the relationship between the US and South Korea is better when you have a conservative government in South Korea than a progressive one. Which doesn't mean, by the way, that South Koreans should vote for conservatives. That's not what I'm trying to argue. I'm just saying that the relationship is less rocky because the goals, I think, are more similar. Is unification possible? Yeah. But it's probably far away, because North Korea has turned out to be much more resilient, I think, than a lot of people expected. So the traditional theory of North Korea is that it's this super autocracy, that it's governed by like the one great man, the Sun King. When you go to North Korea, I mean, that's like how the Kim family is presented. Everywhere you go, it's like, this is Kim Il-sung Square, and this is Kim Jong-un School, and this is Kim Jong-un Street. I mean, everything is named after, like, the Kims. The guides in North Korea, they used to tell us, it's not Democratic People's Republic of Korea or North Korea, it's Gimnara. It's the land of the Kims. Like, they own it. It's like their personal property. And so we used to think that, oh, well, if it's given that out and it's owned by the Kim family, if they die, then, North Korea is going to change. And this is what happened in 2011. Kim Jong-il had a heart attack, right? And he didn't wake up. And everybody thought, wow, this is going to be this big change, right? The Sun King just didn't wake up. He's just gone. And so now all these groups in North Korea will start fighting for power and stuff like that. And that didn't happen. The system was much more resilient. The system didn't miss a beat, right? Kim Jong-un kind of stepped into the role 13 years later, and he's pretty solidly in charge. And I think that's the real stumbling block for unification, right? North Korea looks really weak on the outside. It doesn't have much infrastructure, right? Its economy is terrible. North Korean GDP is, I think, like 4% of your GDP. It's got all kinds of problems with poverty and malnutrition. And so it looks like North Korea is always on the verge of falling apart. And so we always say, oh, unification's around the block. Unification is coming if, when North Korea falls apart like any other third world country. But North Korea doesn't fall apart. And so the division just kind of goes on and on and on. I think the most likely possibility for unification in the future is if Kim Jong-un passes away and, there's some kind of internal factional conflict. But that didn't happen in 2011. So I don't ever make predictions about Korean unification anymore because what I thought would create unification didn't work in 2011. So maybe I'm not an expert after all. Maybe I don't know what I'm talking about. But South Korea is not going to become more like North Korea. It's not. South Korea is not going to become a dictatorship to have unification, which means North Korea has got to become more like South Korea. And that can't happen as long as the Kim family is in power. And no one knows how to get rid of the Kim family. Nobody knows. So, we're kind of stuck. The Korean division is pretty deeply rooted. Yes. So North Korea is conventionally pretty far behind South Korea, which is to say the South Korean military is much stronger than the North Korean military. So that's great, right? South Korea's got a really good, capable military. That's fantastic. Which means that North Korea would almost certainly use nuclear weapons, tactical nuclear weapons, small ones, to make up for its conventional backwardness. Certainly, strategically, that would probably be the wise thing to do, right? And if the two Koreas are fighting and the South Koreans start winning, which would almost certainly happen, the South Korean army, ROK-A marching north and basically eliminating North Korea. And then what choice would the North Koreans have? Either to be pushed out, to be eliminated, or to launch, or to use nuclear weapons. So I think in the case of a conflict, like an open war between the two, I think most people agree, I think most analysts agree that North Korea would use nuclear weapons, and they would probably do it first. The more interesting question is whether or not North Korea would use nuclear weapons in a crisis. And this is what I worry about the most. The reason the North Koreans might use nuclear weapons in a crisis is because North Korea is so conventionally weak otherwise that it would really benefit from moving first. North Korea has what we call a big first mover advantage. If the two Koreas fight, North Korea is almost certainly going to lose. So in a crisis, the North Koreans think a war is going to happen like in a week. They should drop nuclear weapons, 6 days beforehand. They should sort of get the war started before you guys have the chance to start moving, because once the South Korean military gets mobilized for a really serious conflict, the North Koreans are almost certainly going to lose. You can think of this, for example, like in Ukraine. In the crisis that led up to the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022, a lot of people said the Russians are about to invade, but then the Ukrainians basically just waited. Why? Well, Ukraine was big enough and its military was good enough that it could absorb a Russian advance and still survive. North Korea can't do that. Once you guys are marching through North Korea, it's all over. North Korea is going to fall apart really, really rapidly. So if you're North Korea, you have huge incentives to preempt, to move first, right? If you really think a crisis is about to turn into a war, then you should shoot first because you're otherwise so weak. And that's what I really worry about, is the North Koreans might talk themselves into first use of nuclear weapons because they think a war is going to happen. They're almost certainly going to lose that war. So the smart thing to do is to get their nuclear weapons out of the ground before the Americans and the South Koreans start bombing them. And then you end up talking yourself into a war that might not have actually happened. To me, that's the biggest threat. The North Koreans might come to believe their own propaganda that a war is about to happen, and if they think that's going to happen and the American planes are going to be flying over in 6 hours bombing their nuclear sites, the smart thing to do is launch. Get their stuff in the air before the Americans hit it. So you could get into this kind of like preemptive spiral, right, where each side is trying to preempt the other one, and North Korea, unlike Ukraine, North Korea can't wait. The longer the North Koreans wait to fight, if a fight is coming, the better their chances of losing. That's a really good question, too. I think that the more the North Koreans build big missiles that can strike the United States, intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBM. The more North Korea builds ICBMs and the bigger nuclear weapons they put on top of those, I think the greater the likelihood the United States will be hesitant to fight for you. I worry about this a lot. So there's a whole debate about whether or not South Korea should get its own nuclear weapons. And I'm actually sympathetic to this. I think South Korea should investigate whether or not it needs nuclear weapons, because I think the American nuclear umbrella isn't as good as it was 10 years ago, because now North Korea can strike the United States with a nuclear weapon. Which means if we come in here and fight for you, that opens the U.S. homeland. Not just U.S. bases, not just like, Humphreys and Pyeongtaek, right? Not just sort of smaller U.S. bases in the region. Now the U.S. homeland is potentially at risk, right? The North Koreans have missiles that could in fact strike, San Francisco or LA or Las Vegas or something like that. And so that raises the level of nuclear risk for the United States. If we fight for you, if you follow the South Korean nuclear debate, this is actually one of the things people are talking about, right? Are the Americans going to maintain the nuclear umbrella if it means they might be struck? If the Americans aren't so sure because they're worried about getting hit by a nuclear weapon, maybe we should build our own. I actually think that's a pretty good argument. That doesn't mean that South Korea should build nuclear weapons immediately. I don't think you need to do that right away. But I do think there's a reason why. I do think the South Korean nuclear debate responds to legitimate concerns, which is this question. If you're Kim Jong-un and everything is falling apart, right? The American bombers are flying overhead, the South Korean army is rolling through your cities, what are you going to do? You're going to launch, and you're probably going to hit the United States too, because you're going to hope if you strike the Americans, you can convince the Americans to stop. We call this escalation to de-escalate. In other words, once we start attacking North Korea, their only chance is to nuke us, to convince us to stop, and then they're going to say, if you don't stop attacking us, we're going to nuke you again. That's really the only option they have, because their conventional military is so far behind. It's this really weird, paradoxical finding. North Korea is so conventionally weak that it actually makes it really dangerous with nuclear weapons, because they have huge incentives to use their nuclear weapons early because everything else is so bad. Their tanks are 30 years old. They don't have enough fuel for their armored vehicles. Their soldiers aren't very well fed. I mean, North Korea has actually got a big military, but it's not a very good one. So nuclear weapons are really all they have. And so if they don't use them, we're going to bomb them. So they got to use them quick, right? Or they got to get them out of the ground immediately. Because they have very high first use incentives, that means it's much more likely the Americans will also get hit in a war. We don't want that, so maybe we might hesitate, and therefore you South Koreans are thinking about that too and saying, okay, maybe we need our own nuclear weapons. One, the United States strongly opposes South Korean nuclearization. The United States has opposed the nuclearization of all of its allies. I do think, however, that if you ignored us and you just did it anyway, I don't think the alliance would collapse. I don't think the Americans would break the relationship over this, unless Trump is president, in part because Trump won't care what you guys do. But if you have a traditional president in there who values the relationship, like Joe Biden, then I don't actually think that South Korean nuclearization would break the relationship. It would strain it, but I don't think it would break it. The nuclear debate in Korea in the last couple years, I think that kind of pushed the Americans a little bit to rethink South Korean security. But the Yoon administration signed the Washington Declaration and agreed to it, and basically said that South Korea doesn't want to risk a breach with the Americans in order to build nuclear weapons. So for a while, at least, that's not going to happen because President Yoon just agreed to not do it. But I do think the nuclear pressure from North Korea that motivates this discussion, that's not going to go away. The North Koreans are going to build bigger nuclear weapons. They're going to build faster missiles. They're going to have longer range missiles. And so the nuclearization of North Korea that's driving the nuclearization of South Korea debate, that will get worse, which means the South Korean debate will get worse. So even though the South Koreans signed the Washington Declaration last year, I don't really believe this debate will go away. I think we'll probably be talking about South Korean nuclear weapons in 2 or 3 years because the South Koreans are going to worry again. The North Koreans are going to make all these nuclear threats on TV in like a year or two. They always do this. South Koreans are going to get worried. People are going to say we need our own nuclear weapons. Maybe the Americans are going to help fight for us. I mean, this is going to happen again and again and again. And a lot of that is because North Korea is really reliant on its nuclear weapons for the reasons I talked about before. North Korea is so conventionally weak that it has to talk about its nuclear weapons all the time. And that just scares the hell out of people down here in South Korea. I mean, I really understand why South Korea wants its own nuclear weapons, because the North Koreans talk about them all the time and in a really scary way, right? I mean, it's like if the North Koreans would just shut up on nuclear weapons, I think maybe the South Koreans wouldn't be so nervous. But the North Koreans say the most outlandish, scary stuff, and they just scare the hell out of people. And so I think that's driven a lot of the debate down here, and the North Koreans aren't going to change. They're going to keep talking like this. They're going to build more missiles. They're going to build more warheads. And so the debate will keep coming back and back. And I think in time, my guess is that in time, maybe in like 10 or 15 years, the Americans will just say, okay, you South Koreans can, build your own small arsenal. You guys don't actually need very many nuclear weapons. I've written about this. You guys only need like 30 or 40 on submarines. You guys don't need a huge arsenal like North Korea or China. So I don't actually think it would be that, the adjustment to a South Korean nuclear arsenal wouldn't actually be that difficult because yours would actually be really small. But anyway. So that's a great question. One, I think denuclearization of North Korea is unrealistic unless we give the North Koreans basically enormous concessions that would be politically impossible. You could get North Korea to denuclearize if you gave up the U.S. alliance and pulled out all U.S. forces Korea and you shrank the size of the South Korean military by 80%. But that's not going to happen. And South Korean intelligence has said this for a while, the National Intelligence Service and a lot of the analyst community. Tae Yong-ho, for example, right, the North Korean defector, right, he said this, that the North Koreans just aren't going to do this. And I think the big reason is what we've talked about already here a couple times, which is that North Korea is very conventionally weak, so nuclear weapons are its one big strength. And if the North Koreans had a big, powerful military, better conventional, traditional military, they wouldn't need the nuclear weapons. But because the North Korean economy, under the kind of corrupt socialism of the Kim family, the North Korean economy can't produce enough to actually properly kit the North Korean conventional military, nuclear weapons are a great fallback. That's why they have them, and that's why they probably won't give them up. I think more realistic would be to try to get North Korea into some kind of arms control deal. I congratulate the Moon administration for making this effort. I kind of feel bad for President Moon because he really, really tried. He really, 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 really wanted to deal with the North Koreans. And, he's hugging Kim Jong-un on TV and saying he's a nice guy and talking about how polite he was. He was using the honorific properly in Korean. We have to learn that when we study Korean, use the honorific. So Moon really wanted a deal. He really wanted something on this, and he really made an effort. And Donald Trump, in his own way, wanted a deal too. Donald Trump doesn't care about South Korea or nuclear weapons. He wanted the deal because he wanted a Nobel Prize. But whatever. The point is that Trump wanted a deal, and so did Moon. And so for a few years there, the North Koreans had a great opportunity to actually get a deal. I'm actually really surprised that Kim Jong-un didn't go for that, because for a brief moment, you had Moon in South Korea, Trump in the United States. You had two presidents who were much more willing to negotiate with North Korea than any other president in the history of the U.S. or in South Korea, and they really wanted a deal, and Kim passed it up. To me, the fact that Kim missed that opportunity, he had 3 years to negotiate with these two presidents who really wanted a deal, and he still passed it up. The fact that he passed it up tells me that the North Koreans don't want any kind of deal on nuclear weapons. They're just going to build, 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 build. They had a great chance between 2018 and 2020, and they passed it up. And to be honest, I'm really amazed, actually. I'm just kind of shocked that Kim didn't go for some kind of deal, because Trump would have given him a lot. Trump really, really, really wanted that Nobel, and he would have given up a lot to get it. Just in the same way that I think Moon Jae-in really wanted a breakthrough deal and was prepared to give a lot of money and a lot of aid. But Kim didn't do it, so denuclearization is not realistic. How should South Korea respond to North Korea? Oh my God, these questions. Okay, you can't just freeze out North Korea. You can't just completely pretend they don't exist. This is something that I see with a lot of my undergraduates at Busan Daehakyo. I think there's this sense that, North Korea is like this other country, and, we don't really have to care about them, and, I want to go off and watch BTS and YouTube and play on my phone and go study overseas, and, I want to go and, I want to go to California or Europe or whatever. And that's great. I understand. I understand why South Korea wants to kind of project itself as this power distinct from North Korea, somewhat disjoined from it, and South Korea doesn't have to be responsible for all of North Korea's crazy behavior. I don't really think that's feasible. I understand why, and being a resident of South Korea myself, I'm sympathetic to that too. It's like, can't we just cut North Korea loose and let them go? The problem is that the North Koreans are Koreans, and the rest of the world kind of looks at North Korea and says to South Korea, you got to fix this mess. Like they're your ethnic kinsmen, right? You're one minjok. It's like your mess. I think South Korea has tried to sort of draw some distance from North Korea, and it just doesn't work. That's when the North Koreans start shooting shells over the DMZ, or you get some incident on the northern limit line or something like that. You can't disengage from North Korea because they're your countrymen. I mean, they are, right? And also, right, honestly, too, geopolitically, you live right next to them, right? I mean, the North Koreans are right on top of you with a gigantic military 20 miles away from Seoul. So you have to like respond to it. Okay, so you have to engage them. You should talk to them and whatever. I don't think you can recognize them. I don't think you can actually have the two Koreas have embassies and stuff. That's denied by the South Korean Constitution. If Moon Jae-in's breakthrough with North Korea had worked, I think you would actually have to amend and change the South Korean Constitution to actually have full recognition. I'm not a lawyer, but I don't believe that's actually legally permitted at the moment. So what that means then is you're like in this gray zone, right? You can't recognize them, you can't ignore them, right? And so you got to negotiate with them. You just have to keep talking and talking and talking. And again, I give Moon Jae-in some credit. At least he tried to talk to them. I don't think he did it the right way, but at least he was talking to them. You know, aid is a good idea. Getting Western or aid groups in North Korea to sort of at least alleviate the worst of the famines and stuff like that. The malnutrition, I support those sorts of things. I do think that you might be able to trade the sanctions on North Korea. You know, there's a lot of debate in South Korea about the sanctions on North Korea. I do think the sanctions shouldn't just be tossed away. I think they should be traded to North Korea. You should sort of agree to roll back some of the sanctions on North Korea if the North Koreans make some changes. And one other thing I would emphasize, besides engagement, is you shouldn't expect the rest of the world to fix this problem. One thing that always kind of worries me when I do sort of like Korean media and stuff like that, they're like, well, what do the Americans think about North Korea? And my question is always like, wait, you're South Korea. It's your responsibility first. I'm not saying that America shouldn't help you. Whatever, we're your ally and we should. But you shouldn't buck past the problem onto the Americans or to the Chinese or anybody else. I mean, ultimately, you guys need to figure this out. And I all for America helping, but it's much more important that the Yoon administration have a North Korea policy than the Biden administration. I mean, you guys should make a lot of effort on this. I'm not saying that you don't. But I'm often surprised how much I hear people say to me, well, aren't the Americans going to help? Or what do the Americans want to do in North Korea? I'm like, well, why are you coming to us? You live next to them, and you can speak the language, and you know the culture, and you've got to sort of deal with this mess. North Korea is the dominant issue in your foreign policy, even though I think a lot of South Koreans don't like that. I get it, but North Korea is the dominant issue in your foreign policy, and there's just really no way around that. It's just, it's this really, really difficult problem, and you just have to keep working it and working it and working it. That's all I prepared for today. If you enjoyed the content, please subscribe to the channel, like it, and set the notification. Thank you.